What's up, everybody? We got some more food for you guys. Make sure you press the like button. That's very important on this channel. Dr. Wesley's Anunnaki. Check it out. Everybody, what's up? This is Super Mike. We're doing some work on the B1 Math Science and History channel. Since me reading this, Dr. Wesley's Anunnaki were not from the Hebrew, but they were from Black Arabian gods. I tried to do a little bit more research on what the Anunnaki were, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, Ube, try to research some of the terminology that's done inside of this report. We know that the term Afrabia that Dr. Wesley uses is based on the fact that, the Middle East is a disputed piece of terminology. It's basically Africa, Northeast Africa. He's saying that the plants are indigenous to both sides, animals are indigenous to both sides. If you look at the plate tectonics, they have websites where you can go read on the history of how the African plate moves. You'll see that Arabia, the land that's called Arabia, has been connected to it all the time. So just the modern cartographers decided, which are whites, decided that there's a border here on the Red Sea, and we're going to call this part Africa, and we're going to call this part the Middle East or something else. So he's just going to say, he's saying that it's really Afrabia. So it's one land. So the same people, if you go over there, look at some of the Houthis, the pictures of them, the Yemenis, it's easy to see that these are similar people as the Ethiopians or Axumites or, some of those people. We know some of the stories. If you research Olodumare in the, Yoruba tradition in Nigeria, what's called Nigeria right now, which was named by, a white woman. Just recently, I think less than 100 years ago, when they got their independence and stuff. That Olodumare came from Arabia. He was black people, but he came from Arabia. So, it was just showing how some of the places in Mesopotamia, which is called Iraq, Iran, the Fertile Crescent, that area started to desiccate and some of the people started to travel and go to different parts. And these are some of the histories. So make sure you check out some of that, some of the information on it. It is a vital historical record. It's a vital history that we should know because it gives us background and it helps us to eliminate some of the pointless debates. A lot of times some of the debates are based on ignorance, and some of the debates that I see, especially on the internet, are from people who really don't want to know what's actually true. They just kind of want to argue, and it's just fun for them, I guess, to just argue because they hate what they call religion. They hate, all of these people too had religious systems. People talking about, oh, they stole this religion from this religion. And I'm like, look, you're getting everything that we have today came from someone else prior. It existed before it was named. So we got to, some of the stuff that is being debated is not really, authentic. They just having what they call, just insincere debating. So anyway, let's go back and let's go through some more of the reading. We're going to go through some more pages. He was saying how the Dravidians, Sumerians, uh, and the African language, they have an affinity. The Dravidian languages show a strong affinity. Well, I think it was said a strong affinity with African languages. He goes, I'm not going to be focusing on the too many of the footnotes because if you're really interested, you can just go get it. I'm just going to start reading through it. So he said the Sumerians surely did not look like Life magazine's depiction of them. And we know that, our enemies love to deceive. All right. So he says Buxton and Rice use loaded terms to describe these two populations, Eurafrican and brown race. Mediterranean type, as Runoko Rashidi aptly notes, these are ridiculous and ethnic euphemisms, and Sheikh Anta Diop correctly exposes these terms as simply euphemisms for Negro, i.e. black person generally. We really don't like the term Negro because we know where that comes from. It means dead. It's Latin. It's the language of our enemies who, in the Punic Wars wanted to destroy our civilization. Sergei describes this alleged racial type in The Mediterranean Race, a study of the origin of European peoples. So this is what Sergei says. This stock, in its external features, is a brown human variety, neither white nor negroid, but pure in its elements. That is to say, not a product of the mixture of whites with Negroes or Negroid people. The external characters are brown color of the skin, eyes, hair, beard, and the hair on other parts of the body. The body is well formed and proportioned, of median stature. The nose is either leptorhine or mesorhine, more or less narrow. The apertures of the eyes horizontal and rather large. The lips sometimes thin and sometimes a little thick and fleshy. Because most of these features are non-Negroid, early race scientists claimed that these brown-skinned peoples that originated in Africa, thus Eurafrican, it included such called groups as the Galas of Ethiopia and the Somalis were actually brown-skinned Caucasians. It has been demonstrated, however, that these physical traits actually represent an authentic indigenous African phenotype and has nothing to do with Caucasians or Europeans, as well argued by Wyatt McAfee. The continued use of these euphemisms in scholarly literature is ideological rather than scientific. So this is what McAfee says. It is clear that the brown or Mediterranean race is an extremely imprecise concept. Its survival is attributed to its ideological usefulness, no small part of which lies in its ambiguity. In a word, it is a myth. The brown race concept is without scientific value and must be regarded as a myth with specific ideological functions related to the colonial situation. Dana Marnich likewise made the point well. New interpretation of biology evolution along the Nile have helped to dispel the myth of the ancient Mediterranean as a type affiliated with modern Europeans or Caucasoids. The perceived lessening of Negroid attributes does not nullify the fact that the ancient type designated Proto-Mediterranean or Brown Mediterraneans since the turn of the century was in no way allied to nor descended from the type now designated Europoid or Caucasoid. On the contrary, it is today indisputable that the early Mediterraneans, who appear to have been among the first settled agriculturalists of Europe, Africa, and Southwest Asia, were direct genetic and cultural descendants of the Upper Paleolithic hunter of the Nile and North Africa. So, Sumerians as Afrabian Cushites. We now know that these Sumerians came to Mesopotamia after developing in the Arabian cradle, as was early suspected. George A. Barton asked the question, "Whence came the Sumerians?" And he answered, "They originated in Oman in eastern Arabia." Michael Rice has more recently and more solidly made the case. The hypothesis of Hermel Herstein that the Sumerians originally migrated from Africa through the southern Arabia, Oman, and northward towards the head of the Persian Gulf, eventually settling into the Tigris-Euphrates area, is consistent with this hypothesis. The Sumerians themselves point to Dilmun, the archetypal Holy Land, as their place of origin. This land is eastern Arabia generally, and later Bahrain in particular, as P.V. Glob and T.J. Bibley state. What do they state? Bahrain has proved to be the legendary Dilmun, referred to in the cuneiform text of Sumer, the bridge between the primary seat of urban revolution and the civilization of the Indus Valley in now what is Pakistan. The fabled Dilmun is the place of origin of the Anunnaki, as Rice notes. Certainly the gods of summer were always identified with Dilmun. The myths which associate Dilmun as the place of origins, the birthplace of the gods, were Sumerian. This is particularly the case with Enki, the most beloved of the Mesopotamian gods, the god who brought the Holy Land, the God who brought secrets of science, writing, and arts to Mesopotamia. He came from Dilmun. This Holy Land is also where the Sumerian deities meet in assembly to decree fates according to some Mesopotamian texts. Now that's pretty important. So it says this Holy Land. Let me see something here. So yeah, this Holy Land is also where the Sumerian deities, so that's their gods, the Sumerian deities meet in assembly to decree fates according to some Mesopotamian text. Already in the 4th millennium BCE, Dilmun was a thriving center of trade, and Dilmun's civilization dominated eastern Arabia until 2000 BCE. The apex of this East Arabian civilization was during the Berber period, which is the 3rd millennium BCE, which is about We call that about 4,000, 5,000 years ago. And the remains of the Berber temples still exist today as a testament of this Kushite empire. And Kushites are black, just so you know. The eventual desiccation of the Arabian Peninsula likely pushed these Arabian Kushites northward in search of wetter environments. As Michael Rice explains. What does Michael Rice explain? In the 6th and 5th millennium BC, and perhaps from much earlier still, there was, all the evidence now suggests, a significant population in eastern Arabia, and particularly in the southeastern quadrant of the peninsula. It has been suggested that the people of this region were ancestral to the people who made the Ubaid pottery. They in turn were probably ancestral to the Sumerians. So these are the Sumerians' ancestors, according to the information that they have found. They were in all probability well established around the periphery of the Rub al-Khali, and especially in what is now northern Oman. But gradually, the climate began to deteriorate, and the desert, represented in Egyptian mythology by Set, the god of confusion and lord of the east, began to move in towards the area, which had previously been able to support a population of men and animals. The people were forced to move, some eastward and then north, others westward along the edges of the dying lakes. These would reach the Red Sea. Then the journey to Egypt would once more face the people of Southeast Arabia, as it had perhaps already faced some who had gone on the long sea route. So we have discussed the westward Nile bound migrants in other works, and he's talking about his book, titled Arabia, basically. Black Arabia and the African origins of Islam. So he discussed the Nile-bound migrants in other works. The northward moving Arabians turned Sumerians brought with them a relatively high civilization, George Barton describes. Certainly as early as 3500 BC, and perhaps as early as 4000 BC, which is about 6,000 years, the Sumerians pushing up the Persian Gulf from the south made their way into southern Babylonia. The memory of their coming is reflected in the myth of Oannes, recounted to us by Berosos, who taught men how to construct houses, till the earth, compile laws, and all other useful knowledge. It is clear that the Sumerians were highly civilized when they entered Babylonia. They knew the arts of agriculture by 3500 BC. They could make beautiful objects of gold and silver, surpassing in craftsmanship and beauty anything found in Egypt until centuries later. They could write. They had invented the principle of the real arch and dome, and they had invented the use of the wheel and had chariots. The Sumerians were thus migrants from the Arabian interior, and the grandeur of the civilization that they established by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers witnessed to the level of skill and civilization that existed among the Arabian Kushites in remote antiquity. Of particular importance for this discussion is the fact that the Sumerian religion derives from that of the Arabian Kushites. We will return to this point below. So basically, showing Arabia as vagina gentum. So Sumer is at the top, Kemet is pictured to the left, and India is to the right, and Arabia is the center. So Sumer, Kemet, India. Sir E.A. Wallace Budge, Egyptologist as well as Assyriologist, noted in the gods of the Egyptians, it is surprising to find so much similarity existing between the primeval gods of Sumer and those of Egypt, especially as the resemblance cannot be the result of borrowing, and we are therefore driven to the conclusion that both the Sumerians and the early Egyptians derived their primeval gods from some common but exceedingly ancient source. What was that source? The remarkable similarity between Sumer, Mesopotamia, and Egyptian civilizations has been frequently noted, highlighting the contemporary and exceptionality, fine quality of Ubad pottery and Bedarian Egyptian pottery, and suggesting a common origin as the cause. Michael Rice points out, this phenomenon, so unlikely in any event and doubly so with two apparent quite desperate peoples living relatively far from each other, is one of the most puzzling of the early, more or less simultaneous developments of Egypt and Sumer. The apparently common factors which manifest themselves in Egypt and Sumer are too many not to warrant some speculation about the possibility of their common or at least related origin. Equally remarkable are the parallels between Egypt and India. Nicholas Kazanas wrote recently, there are more than 20 motifs, themes, exhibiting close affinities in the religious texts of the Vedic and Egyptian peoples. These affinities are close and suggest either a common origin for both cultures or cross influences. However, most of the motifs have correspondences in other Indo-European traditions. This fact suggests that the motifs are inherited in the Vedic text and not borrowed from Egypt. Thus, we may conclude either that the Saptasidinhu, the land of the Vedic people in ancient India, Pakistan, influenced India, or that both cultures derive or borrow from a third unknown one. Jeannie Sand points out also, neither historical events nor cross-cultural currents can explain the unique parallels in the myths and imagery of ancient Egypt and India. Not to be overlooked here are the commonalities between Sumeria, Mesopotamia, and Indic traditions. Kanzanas has documented close affinities in the Vedic and Mesopotamian religious thought. And Asko Parpola too has documented the commonality between the ancient Indus Valley and Mesopotamian religions. How do we account for these assonances between widely disparate cultures and civilizations? Paulinus Tambutu wrote, "The resemblance between the Mesopotamian and Indus civilizations would imply that both had a common source, and this common source would appear to be Dravidian." Paul William Roberts too opined that India, Egypt, Babylon, Mesopotamia, as well as Israel were in fact inheritors of the legacy of a lost civilization. There must have been one. There are too many similarities between hieroglyphic texts and Vedic ones. These, in turn, echoed in somewhat diluted form and a confused fashion by the authors of the Babylonian texts and the Old Testament. It is indeed likely that this commonality is due to a common origin, or for some Mesopotamian and Indic peoples, as well as a common origin for these and some Egyptian populations. Rice theorizes that the common culture from which the Sumerians and Egyptians evolved was Arabian. Carlton Coons suggested that with the post-glacial desiccation of the Near East, Arabia served as a vagina gentum, womb of nations, sending forth into other regions great numbers of inhabitants whom it would no longer support. I have argued, Dr. Wesley says, I have argued elsewhere, in fact, Black Arabia or Afrabia was the vagina gentum, or womb of nations that sent forth into other regions, north into Mesopotamia, west into Kemet, and east into India, great numbers of inhabitants, whom it could no longer support, and whom brought with them to their new locations their religio culture, which in essence was the same, even though each migrating group developed its own cultural dialect in its new home. Part 3, Afro-Akkadians. The earliest documentable Semites, or rather the earliest Semitic language documented in writing, appears in ancient Mesopotamia, though the original home of these speakers was likely Arabia. The Akkadians in the north gave us our oldest textual evidence of a Semitic language. Akkadian personal names appear in Sumerian texts, dated using short chronology to about 2700 to 2600 BCE, and connected Akkadian texts appear 2350 BCE. This textual evidence should not, however, be taken to suggest that Semites only then appeared on the Mesopotamian plain. Semites, either Akkadians or a Semitic language group that had settled before them, may very well have contributed to the urbanization that took place in the end of the 4th millennium BCE. The Sumerian king list places the first dynasty of Kish together with a series of kings bearing Akkadian names immediately after the flood. Samuel Kramer says these nameless Semites, Samuel Kramer says these nameless Semites, who presumably came to the region early in the 4th millennium BC. There are a number of loan words in the older Sumerian texts which point to Semitic-speaking people as the ruling ethnic group immediately preceding the Sumerians. S. Langdon noted as well. Traces of Semitic influence are found in the very earliest Sumerian inscriptions, not the Semitic loan word Damkar, merchant, in pre-Sargonic contracts of Surupak and Damgara, Tamharu, battle in an inscription of Entemena. Still, more important is the fact that the Sumerian word for to purchase, sam, in very earliest inscriptions in Semitic Semites were in southern Sumer long before Sargon founded the first Semitic dynasty at Akkad about 2850 BC, and their influence is being verified by the excavation of every ancient Sumerian city. The evidence of archaeology and philology is all in favor of the Semites as equally old in central Mesopotamia. Original Semites, not half Semi breeds. In many scholarly circles, particularly Afrocentric, it is popularly believed that Semites are by definition half Semi breeds, black and white crossbreeds. This perspective was argued forcefully, for example, by historian, scientist, and scholar par excellence Sheikh Anta, who, due to his impeccable academic credentials, gave this perspective an air of unassailability. This is, however, one of the few areas of Diop's tremendous scholarly output that must be updated and corrected in light of new data. According to Diop, anthropologically and culturally speaking, the Semitic world, was born during proto-historic times from the mixture of white-skinned and black-skinned people in West Asia. He further argues that the formation of the Semitic branch occurred between the 5th and 4th millennium. This was a genuine interbreeding between white, non-Mongoloid Cro-Magnon and black at the beginning of the historical era. The Negro type inhabited the Arabia Peninsula in Neolithic times. This type progressively crossbred with white elements came from the northeast to give rise finally to the Arabian type. Not until the Sabaean era, 1000 BC, was this crossbreeding complete in the south. Thus, some Semites in general and Arabs in particular are by definition half-breeds. All Semites, Arabs and Jews, are mixed breeds of black and white. The Arab race cannot be conceived as anything but a mixture of blacks and whites. The entire Arab people, including the Prophet, are mixed with Negro blood. Diop's ethno-historical reconstruction of Arabia, Arabs, and Semites is problematic on a number of priori and posteriori counts. First, his perspective is a bit incoherent and difficult to follow. Thus, in his magnum opus, Civilization and Barbarism, in his magnum opus, Civilization and Barbarism, 1991, Diop affirms that the formation of the Semitic branch occurred between the 5th and 4th millennium, 54. Yet on page 23, Diop states that in the 5th. So yet on page 23, Diop states that in the 5th millennium, Semites do not yet exist, and that the first appearance of Semites was 2400 BCE with the Akkadians. On the other hand, Diop suggests that it was, in fact, the Jewish people, not the Akkadians, who were the first branch called Semites. Among the evidence he cites in the latter claim is the 13th dynasty, in Roman numerals, 13th dynasty, so 1991 BCE to 1802 BCE. Egyptian depiction of white Hebrews, and an 11th century CE Byzantine image of a white Abraham. These are surely anachronistic pointers to the ancient Semites. Diop further describes the Semites as a brachiocephalic, round-headed, yellow-skinned race, and says Semites, Akkadians, Arabs, Jews, 5,000 years ago. It is thus not at all clear whether the Akkadians who appear in history in the 5th millennium or 3rd, or Jews who appear much later, are the first Semites, and it is not clear whether the Semites go back to the 5th millennium, the 3rd millennium, or the 2nd millennium, the time of Abraham. Regarding Arabs in particular, Diop noted, I have demonstrated in my earlier books all the biological and cultural kinship between Arabs and Black Africans. A kinship so old that it goes back to the 5th millennium BC and the beginning of the 4th with the birth of the Semitic world. Diop argues correctly that the original population of Arabia was a Negro Cushite type, and that in fact prior to the 18th century BC, only Negroes, Cushites in official terminology, were found in the region of Arabia. Infiltrations before the 2nd millennium were relatively insignificant. In the 18th century BCE, a group of wild barbaric white hordes, Jectonides, entered the peninsula from the northeast and destroyed the early Arabian Kushite Empire. Soon, however, the indigenous Kushites regained political and cultural control, and these early whites were absorbed culturally by the Kushites. These defeated whites and subsequent half-breed, who now share the language and customs of the Arabian Kushites, are given to believe the Arab race and Semites. Thus, it is important to change our notions about the Semite. Whether in Mesopotamia, Phoenicia, or Arabia, the Semite, insofar as he is discernible objectively, appears as the product of Negro-white mixture. A review of the current data, as well as we will undertake in the next section, forces us to admit that Diop's conclusions regarding the Semites in general and the Akkadians and Arabs in particular are unsustainable. The Semites were no Asian half-breeds, as Diop postulated, but were indigenous Africans who, having likely originated in Middle Africa and separating from its parent Afro-Asiatic stock, descended the Nile and crossed over into Arabia. As we saw, the two populations of Sumer and Akkad both represent Africoid peoples. The Semitic Akkadians are morphologically related to the Sumerians, and the two groups are likely variations of the same physical type. Contra Dei. There is little evidence that the Semitic Akkadians were half-breeds, while the third ethnic group evidenced in Kish remains is the Armenoid type, brachiocephalic, round-headed whites. The morphological measurements give no indication that the Akkadians are a cross between these and the Africoid, Dravidicoid Sumerians. The physical evidence suggests the opposite. Such a crossbreeding would be evidence, for example, in the length of the Akkadian head, which would have been at least mesocephalic, medium. But the Semitic Akkadians defy this expectation. They are long-headed like the Sumerians. In short, both Sumerians and the Semitic Akkadians were an Africoid group. Lipinski thus notes. A worsening environmental conditions is indicated in North Africa 3500 BC. With the disappearance of vegetation, a major faunal break, desertification, and desertion. This might have been the period when the speakers of Proto-Semitic passed through the Nile from west to east and reached Western Asia. From North Africa, wave after wave of Semitic migrations would seem to have set forth. The earliest of these migrants and those who went furthest to the east were the Akkadians, who journeyed along the Fertile Crescent through Palestine and Syria, and crossing over to Mesopotamia reached northern Babylon 3000 BC and founded the first Semitic empire of Kish. So we're going to stop it right there. I'm going to show you guys a couple of pictures and we'll start over from here. So just showing how, there was a little controversy there with Dr. Wesley, feeling the need to correct some of Sheikh Anta Diop's conclusions, which a lot of times this gets people into a hissy fit because someone wants to, correct, or they want to argue a point that was made by an honored ancestor. But this is science. This is history. This is stuff that we're supposed to deal with. We should be more concerned with getting a proper understanding versus, some of these, holding on to imprecise conclusions. So that's going to be it, guys. Let me know what you think. I went through a few of these points, and peace.